for soldiers thought they'd found easy prey when Ivy Jackson walked into the training facility that sunny morning. She looked young, carried herself quietly, and spoke with a soft European accent that made her seem out of place among the hardened warriors. They smirked, whispered jokes, and prepared to make her first day unforgettable for all the wrong reasons. What they didn't know was that the new girl they planned to intimidate had already survived Hell Week 3 times, had trained special operations teams across 2 continents, and held a Navy SEAL instructor certification that would make their resumes look like kindergarten artwork. By the end of that day, those 4 cocky soldiers would learn the most humbling lesson of their military careers. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't miss out. Subscribe now for more. The morning sun cast long shadows across Naval Special Operations Base Coronado as Ivy Jackson stepped through the main gate for the first time. At 26 years old, she stood 5'5", with auburn hair pulled back in a regulation bun and green eyes that seemed to take in everything without revealing much in return. Her accent, a blend of her British mother and Dutch father's influences, carried a softness that belied the steel beneath. The guard at the gate barely glanced at her credentials before waving her through. She was used to that, the initial dismissal, the assumption that someone who looked like her couldn't possibly belong in the world of elite warfare. It had followed her from her first day at the Royal Marines training facility in Limpstone, through her cross-training with Dutch Special Forces, and eventually to her unexpected recruitment by U.S. Naval Special Warfare Command. Ivy made her way toward Building 7, where she'd been instructed to report for her new assignment. The paperwork had been deliberately vague, typical of Special Operations protocol. All she knew was that she'd be working with a training cadre, helping to evaluate and prepare candidates for advanced programs. What the paperwork hadn't mentioned was that she'd be the youngest instructor on base, and one of only 3 women in the entire Special Operations Training Division. The hallway of Building 7 echoed with her footsteps as she searched for Room 2B. She passed walls, covered with plaques commemorating fallen warriors, photos of graduating BUD/S classes, and motivational quotes that ranged from inspiring to terrifying. This was hallowed ground in the military world, and Ivy felt the weight of it with every step. She found Room 2B and knocked twice before entering. The room was set up like a small briefing area with maps, tactical displays, and a conference table that had seen better days. 4 men in training uniforms sat scattered around the space, their conversation dying the moment she walked in. The first to speak was a broad-shouldered man with a crew cut and a jaw that looked like it had been chiseled from granite. He sat with his boots propped on the table, arms crossed over his chest. "Can we help you?" he asked, his tone making it clear that helping was the last thing on his mind. "I'm looking for the senior training coordinator," Ivy replied evenly, her accent immediately drawing raised eyebrows from the group. "I'm supposed to report here for my assignment." The 4 men exchanged glances that Ivy had seen 1,000 times before, the look that said, "This should be entertaining." A second man, leaner but with the coiled energy of a predator, leaned forward in his chair. "You must be lost, sweetheart. The administrative offices are in Building 3. This is the Special Operations Training Wing. We don't really do office work here." Ivy set her folder down on the table with deliberate calm. "I'm not looking for the administrative offices. I'm Ivy Jackson, civilian contractor assigned to advanced training evaluation. I believe I'm expected." The third man, who had been quiet until now, actually laughed out loud. He was older than the others, maybe early 30s, with scars that suggested he'd earned his place through hard experience. "You're the new evaluator? They sent us a girl who sounds like she should be serving tea at Buckingham Palace." The fourth man, the youngest of the group but carrying himself with obvious arrogance, stood up and walked a slow circle around Ivy, looking her up and down like she was livestock at an auction. "Let me guess. You've got some fancy degree in psychology or sports medicine. Probably wrote a thesis on optimal training methodologies. Never spent a day in the field, but you're here to tell us how to make better warriors." Ivy turned to face him directly, her expression unchanged. "Are you finished with your assessment, or would you like to continue?" The young one grinned at his companions. "Oh, she's got some fire. I like that. But here's the thing, princess. We've been doing this job for years. We've trained some of the deadliest operators in the world. What we don't need is someone who looks like she'd break in a stiff breeze telling us how to do our jobs." The broad-shouldered man who'd spoken first stood up, clearly the informal leader of the group. Look, no offense, but this is serious business. We're preparing men for combat operations where mistakes cost lives. I'm sure you're very qualified on paper, but this isn't a place for. He gestured vaguely at Ivy. Sensitivity training or whatever headquarters thinks we need. Ivy picked up her folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. She placed it on the table in front of the four men. That's my service record. The unclassified version, anyway. Take a look. The scarred man picked it up first, his eyes scanning the page. His expression shifted from smug superiority to confusion, then to something resembling shock. He passed it to the others without a word. Royal Marines Commando Training. The leader read aloud, his voice losing some of its certainty. Cross-trained with Dutch Corps Commando Tropen. Multiple deployments too. Wait, these locations are redacted. The lean one grabbed the paper, his eyes widening. She's got a SEAL instructor certification. How is that even possible? The young arrogant one snatched the paper, reading it twice as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. This has to be a mistake. There's no way someone who looks like. His voice trailed off as he reached the bottom of the page. Ivy watched them process the information with a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. The person you were expecting was Commander Patterson. He was my mentor before he retired last month. I was his hand-picked replacement. The paperwork got delayed, which is why you got the surprise of my arrival instead of proper notification. The door to room 2B opened, and a gray-haired man in khakis entered. Captain Reynolds had the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades in special operations, and his presence immediately commanded respect. Ah, good. I see you've all met. The four men straightened instantly, their casual arrogance evaporating. Captain, the leader acknowledged. We were just introducing ourselves. Reynolds looked at the group with the expression of someone who'd seen this exact scene play out too many times. Let me make this clear, gentlemen. Instructor Jackson is here because she's the most qualified person we could find to help modernize our evaluation protocols. Her record speaks for itself, though I suspect you've just discovered that. He turned to Ivy. I apologize if my team's welcome was less than professional. No apology necessary, sir, Ivy replied. I'm used to it. After Ivy left the room, the four men sat in silence for a long moment. Finally, Walker spoke. Anyone else feel like we just made a terrible mistake? Davis shook his head. She's bluffing, trying to intimidate us with mystery and build up. Tomorrow we'll do whatever exercise she's planned, probably some modified PT routine, and then we can get back to the real conversation about training protocols. Bennett wasn't so sure. Did you see her record? She's been through programs that make our training look like summer camp. And Patterson picked her as his replacement. He wouldn't have done that if she was just some paper pusher. Harrington stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the base. I've been doing this for 8 years. I've trained hundreds of candidates. I've seen every trick, every technique, every way to break someone down and build them back up. He turned to face the others. But something about her makes me nervous. Like we're about to learn something we really don't want to know. Such as, Davis asked. That maybe we've gotten comfortable, Harrington replied. That maybe we've been coasting on our reputations instead of actually staying sharp. Bennett laughed it off. Come on, man. We're SEAL instructors. We're literally at the top of the food chain. We're at the top, Walker corrected quietly. But she might be higher up than we realized. The next morning would prove just how right he was. Reynolds nodded, though his expression suggested he wasn't pleased with that reality. Jackson, these four men are your training cadre. They'll be working under your supervision for the next evaluation cycle. The shock on the four men's faces would have been comical if it wasn't so predictable. The leader found his voice first. Sir, with all due respect, we've been running these evaluations for 3 years. We have systems in place, protocols that work. I'm not sure we need. What you need, Lieutenant Davis, is to stop talking and start listening, Reynolds interrupted. Your systems are outdated, your pass rates are declining, and your last evaluation cycle produced 2 candidates who washed out of their first operational deployment. That's unacceptable. Davis's jaw clenched, but he nodded. Yes, sir. Reynolds turned back to Ivy. You have complete authority over training design and evaluation standards. These men will provide field expertise and handle the physical instruction, but you're in charge of the overall program. Clear. Crystal, sir, Ivy replied. After Reynolds left, The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. The four men stood in awkward silence, clearly struggling with the reality that the woman they'd just mocked was now their superior. The scarred one was the first to speak. "Look, I'm Harrington. That's Davis." He gestured to the leader. "Walker, the lean one. And the kid there is Bennett." He had the decency to look slightly embarrassed. "We may have gotten off on the wrong foot." "May have." Ivy raised an eyebrow. Bennett, the young arrogant one, stepped forward. His earlier smugness was gone, replaced by defensive posturing. "Okay, so you've got an impressive resume. That doesn't automatically mean you understand what we do here. SEAL training is different from whatever you experienced in Europe." Ivy walked to the tactical display on the wall, studying the current training schedule. "You're running candidates through a modified Hell Week that's been shortened by 18 hours compared to the traditional program. Your underwater training has been reduced to accommodate equipment upgrades. And your land navigation course hasn't been updated in 5 years despite significant changes to operational terrain requirements." Walker crossed his arms. "We made those modifications based on real-world feedback. Modern operations require different skill sets. Modern operations require adaptable warriors who can handle anything," Ivy countered. "What you've created is a training program that produces specialists who excel in controlled environments but struggle when things go wrong. That's why your recent graduates are washing out in the field." Davis bristled. "That's a pretty bold assessment from someone who just walked through the door." Ivy turned to face them. "I spent the last 3 weeks reviewing every evaluation report, every performance metric, and every after-action review from your operational units. The patterns are clear. You're not pushing candidates hard enough in the areas that matter most: stress management, adaptive problem solving, and performance under genuine uncertainty." "Genuine uncertainty?" Harrington scoffed. "Lady, we put these candidates through scenarios that would break most people. We've designed training that simulates combat stress better than anything." "Simulates" being the key word. Ivy interrupted. "Your scenarios are sophisticated, I'll give you that. But they're predictable. Candidates learn the patterns, figure out what you're looking for, and perform accordingly. That's not the same as training someone to function when they have absolutely no idea what's coming next." Bennett laughed, though it sounded forced. "So what's your solution?" "We can't exactly drop them into real combat for training." Ivy pulled out her tablet and brought up a document she'd been working on. "No, but we can create training environments that are genuinely unpredictable. Scenarios where even the instructors don't know all the variables. Evaluations that test not just physical capability, but genuine mental resilience and creative problem solving." She displayed her preliminary training redesign on the room's monitor. The four men leaned in to look, and Ivy watched their expressions change as they processed what they were seeing. Walker spoke first, his voice carrying a note of reluctant respect. "This is actually interesting. You're proposing multi-layered scenarios where candidates face cascading problems with incomplete information. And you want to bring in outside elements," Davis added, reading further. "Civilians, law enforcement, even foreign military observers to create genuine chaos and unpredictability." "Exactly," Ivy confirmed. "Real operations don't happen in a vacuum. They involve multiple stakeholders, conflicting priorities, and situations where the right answer isn't always clear. We should train for that reality." Harrington looked up from the screen, his scarred face thoughtful. "Some of this is going to be hard to implement. The logistics alone are complicated but manageable," Ivy finished. "I've already started coordinating with Base Command. Captain Reynolds is on board, which is why he brought me in." Bennett still looked skeptical. "Okay, so you've got some good ideas. That still doesn't prove you can actually do this job. Training design is one thing. Being able to push candidates to their limits. To know when someone's really broken versus just acting broken. That takes experience in the field." Ivy smiled, and there was something in that expression that made all four men pause. "You want to know if I can push candidates to their limits? If I understand what it takes to create genuine warriors." She walked to the center of the room. "How about a demonstration?" Davis frowned. "What kind of demonstration? You four think you're the elite, right? You've been through the worst training the military has to offer. You've been in combat. You've earned your place here as instructors." Ivy's voice was calm, but carried an edge that hadn't been there before. "Let's see how you handle one of my training exercises." Walker exchanged glances with the others. "You want to put us through a training scenario?" Not exactly, Ivy replied. I want to see how you perform when you're genuinely uncertain about what's happening. When you can't rely on your assumptions or your experience to guide you. Bennett's earlier arrogance was creeping back. Sure, why not? Might be fun to show you what real operators can do. Ivy pulled out her phone and sent a quick message. Tomorrow morning. 0500 hours. Report to the beach in full training gear. Don't eat breakfast, you won't keep it down anyway. Harrington raised an eyebrow. The beach? What are we doing? Building sandcastles. You'll find out when you get there, Ivy said. Oh, and gentlemen, I suggest you get a good night's sleep. You're going to need it.
Davis reached the water's edge and dumped his sand into the container before answering. His teammates waited, buckets still in hand, understanding that his answer affected them all. My greatest fear, Davis said finally, his voice tight, is that you're right. That we've been doing this wrong. That men failed in the field because of decisions I made here. Ivy nodded and marked something on her clipboard. Good, continue. The four men jogged back for another load of sand. The simple acknowledgement of Davis's answer created a strange shift in the atmosphere. What had started as a physical challenge was clearly becoming something else entirely. Walker was next. As he poured his second load of sand, Ivy spoke again. Walker, tell me about the last time you cried. Walker's shoulders tensed. Bennett actually laughed, the sound bitter in the morning air. You can't be serious. I'm completely serious, Ivy replied. Answer or start over. All of you. Walker stared at the container, sand still falling from his bucket. 6 months ago. My daughter's ballet recital. She was the lead. I'd missed the last 3 because of deployments. What made you cry? Ivy pressed, realizing how much I'd missed. How big she'd gotten. Walker's voice cracked slightly, wondering if she even remembered all the times I wasn't there. Ivy's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Thank you for your honesty. Continue. As they ran back for more sand, Bennett muttered to Walker, What the hell kind of training is this? The kind that's working, Harrington replied quietly. Look at us. We're already off balance, and we've barely started. The buckets got heavier with each trip. The weighted vests that had seemed manageable at first began to dig into their shoulders. The sand seemed to multiply, each scoop requiring more effort than the last. 15 minutes in, Ivy called out to Harrington. You have scars on your face and neck. Tell me about the one you're most ashamed of. Harrington dumped his sand before responding. Right shoulder blade. You can't see it through the shirt. Got it during a bar fight in San Diego when I was 22. Thought I was invincible. Picked a fight with the wrong guy. Why are you ashamed of it? Ivy asked. Because all my other scars are from serving my country. That one's from being a stupid kid who thought being tough meant starting fights. Harrington paused. It reminds me that I wasn't always the man I am now. And that scares you, Ivy observed. It wasn't a question. Every damn day, Harrington admitted. Bennett was increasingly agitated with each passing minute. The physical challenge was manageable, he'd been through worse. But the emotional exposure was stripping away his usual defenses. When Ivy finally called his name, he was almost relieved to get it over with. Bennett, you're the youngest here. You project confidence, almost arrogance. Tell me what you're overcompensating for. I'm not overcompensating for anything, Bennett snapped, dumping his sand aggressively. Ivy's voice remained calm. Then you just chose to start everyone over. Back to the beginning, all of you. What? Bennett spun around. That's not fair. I answered your question. You lied, Ivy said simply. I asked for honesty. You gave me ego protection. There's a difference. Davis dropped his bucket with a heavy thud. Bennett. No, Bennett protested. This is ridiculous. We're SEAL instructors, not therapy patients. Walker grabbed Bennett's shoulder. Answer the question, honestly. The sun was rising now. painting the ocean in shades of orange and pink. Bennett stood in the growing light, surrounded by his teammates, facing a woman who somehow saw right through him. "Fine," he said finally. "I'm 27. Everyone else here has a decade more experience. I got this position because I scored off the charts in evaluations, but I know what people say. That I haven't earned it yet. That I'm too young to understand what I'm training people for." "And?" Ivy prompted. "And they're right," Bennett's voice dropped. "I've been on 3 deployments, 3. Davis has been on 12. Harrington has 14. I'm terrified that one day my lack of experience is going to get someone killed because I didn't prepare them properly." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of waves. "Thank you," Ivy said quietly. "That took courage. Now all of you, back to the beginning. Not as punishment, as reset. You're starting this exercise as a real team now, not as 4 individuals trying to prove something." They went back to the sand pile, this time without complaint. Something had shifted. The exercise continued, but now they moved with synchronized purpose rather than competitive pride. As the sun climbed higher, the physical demands increased. Ivy added new elements, requiring them to hold buckets overhead while answering questions, to complete push-ups between runs, to carry each other's vests in addition to their own. The questions became more difficult. Davis admitted his marriage was failing. Walker confessed he sometimes wondered if the men he'd trained who died in combat had died because he hadn't prepared them well enough. Harrington revealed that he stayed in the military partly because he didn't know who he was outside of it. Bennett, stripped of his earlier bravado, talked about the imposter syndrome that kept him awake at night. By the time Ivy called a halt, 90 minutes had passed. The 4 men were drenched in sweat, their legs shaking from exertion. Their minds exhausted from emotional exposure, they collapsed on the sand, breathing hard. While Ivy approached with water bottles. "What you just experienced," she began, handing out the bottles, "is a fraction of what real candidates need to go through. Not the physical part, you already push them physically, but the honest self-assessment, the vulnerability, the understanding that strength isn't just about what you can endure. It's about knowing yourself well enough to know your limits and how to push past them." Davis drank deeply before speaking. "That was brutal." "That was necessary," Ivy corrected. "You 4 are instructors. You're supposed to create warriors who can handle anything. But how can you teach someone to be honest about their capabilities if you can't be honest about your own?" Harrington lay back on the sand, staring at the sky. "I've put hundreds of candidates through Hell Week. I thought I understood what breaks people and what makes them stronger." "You understand part of it," Ivy said. "The physical breaking and rebuilding. But modern warfare isn't just physical anymore. It's psychological warfare. It's moral ambiguity. It's operating in situations where the right choice isn't clear and the consequences of failure are catastrophic." Walker sat up slowly. "So what you're proposing isn't just updating our training protocols. You're suggesting we fundamentally change how we evaluate what makes someone ready for special operations." "Exactly," Ivy confirmed. "Physical capability is necessary but not sufficient. We need warriors who are physically capable, mentally resilient, and emotionally honest. Men who can make split-second decisions under pressure while carrying the weight of moral complexity." Bennett finally spoke, his voice hoarse from exertion and emotion. "I came here this morning planning to prove you wrong. To show you that we didn't need some outsider telling us how to do our jobs. And now?" Ivy asked. "Now I'm wondering how many candidates we failed by not pushing them the way you just pushed us." He looked at his teammates. "We test physical limits. We test tactical knowledge. But we don't test this." He gestured vaguely at himself. "The ability to be honest under pressure." Ivy sat down on the sand facing the 4 men. In the morning light, she looked young and tired. but there was steel in her bearing that commanded respect. "When I was 23, she began, I was in a situation that nearly ended my career before it really started. We were training in Norway, Arctic conditions, and I was the only woman in a unit of 40 men. Most of them didn't want me there." She paused, watching the waves. "During one exercise, we had to navigate through a blizzard to reach a checkpoint. I fell through ice into a river. The water was so cold, it felt like knives. My equipment was dragging me down." Davis leaned forward. "What happened?" "The man closest to me, someone who'd been openly hostile about my presence, jumped in after me. Pulled me out. Probably saved my life." Ivy smiled slightly at the memory. "Afterward, when we were warming up, I thanked him. You know what he said?" "What?" Walker asked. "He said, 'I still don't think women belong in combat units. But I respect that you didn't quit. That counts for something.'" Ivy looked at each of them in turn. "That's when I learned an important lesson. Respect isn't given freely in this world. You have to earn it. But earning it doesn't mean being perfect. It means being honest about who you are and what you can do." Harrington nodded slowly. "Is that why you put us through this exercise? To earn our respect?" "Partially," Ivy admitted. "But mostly to show you that the standards we hold others to need to be standards we hold ourselves to first. You can't train someone to be vulnerable under pressure if you've never experienced it yourself." Bennett looked at his hands, raw from carrying buckets of sand. "So where do we go from here?" "We redesigned the program together," Ivy replied. "You have field experience I don't have. You understand the specific demands of SEAL operations in ways I never will. But I bring a different perspective, different training methodologies, and a willingness to challenge assumptions." Davis stood up, his legs still shaky. "You said Captain Reynolds gave you complete authority over the program." "I did say that," Ivy confirmed. "But you're suggesting a collaboration," Davis continued. "Why?" Ivy rose to face him. "Because authority without input leads to poor decisions. I'm in charge, yes, but I'm not stupid enough to think I have all the answers. The best programs come from combining different perspectives and expertise." Walker and Harrington got to their feet as well, forming a loose circle with Ivy and Davis. "I think I speak for all of us," Walker said, glancing at his teammates who nodded. "When I say we misjudged you yesterday, severely." "You did," Ivy agreed without rancor. "But you're not the first and won't be the last. What matters is what you do with that realization." "We work with you," Harrington said. "Actually work with you, not just pay lip service while undermining you behind your back." Bennett, still sitting in the sand, looked up at them. "I owe you an apology. Yesterday, I was a condescending ass who assumed you couldn't possibly understand what we do here." "Accepted," Ivy said simply. "Though I'll remind you of this moment if you start acting like that again." "Despite everything," Bennett laughed. "Fair enough." Davis extended his hand to Ivy. "Fresh start. We're a team now, and teams work best when everyone's honest about strengths and weaknesses." Ivy shook his hand firmly. "Agreed. Though I should warn you, the program I have in mind is going to push all of us outside our comfort zones." "After this morning," Harrington said. "I think we're ready for that." As they gathered their gear and prepared to leave the beach, the four men found themselves seeing Ivy Jackson in an entirely new light. She wasn't the soft-spoken outsider they'd dismissed yesterday. She was an instructor who understood something fundamental about creating warriors, that true strength required vulnerability, that leadership demanded honesty, and that the best training broke you down not just physically, but emotionally and psychologically as well. The sun was fully up now, warming the sand and evaporating the morning chill. Somewhere on this base, candidates were beginning their training, unaware that the program was about to undergo a radical transformation. In four cocky instructors, who'd thought they'd intimidate the new girl were walking back to base with a newfound respect for her. Someone who just taught them more in 90 minutes than they'd learned in years. We've invested considerable effort in bringing you this story. If you find it engaging, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. Now let's return to the narrative. The transformation of the Special Operations Training Program began immediately. By Monday morning, Ivy had commandeered the main briefing room in Building 7, covering every wall with proposed modifications to the existing curriculum. Davis arrived first, coffee in hand, and stopped in the doorway. "Did you sleep at all this weekend?" Ivy looked up from her laptop, her eyes showing the fatigue of someone who'd worked through the night. Sleep is overrated when you're redesigning a program that affects national security. Over the next hour, the other 3 instructors filtered in. They found Ivy had created a comprehensive breakdown of the current program's weaknesses, backed by data they couldn't dispute. Graduation rates were down 12% over 3 years. Operational readiness scores had declined. Most damning were the confidential reports from field commanders, noting that recent graduates struggled with adaptive decision-making under genuine uncertainty. "This is worse than I thought," Walker admitted, studying the statistics. "I knew we had some issues, but seeing it all laid out like this." "It's a systemic problem," Ivy explained. "Your training is excellent at creating physically capable operators who can execute planned missions. But modern warfare rarely goes according to plan. We need people who can improvise, who can make ethical decisions under pressure, who can lead when command structure breaks down." Bennett pointed to one of her proposed modifications. "You want to add 48 hours to Hell Week? That's going to be a tough sell to command." "Actually," Ivy said, pulling up a different document, "I want to restructure Hell Week entirely. Not make it longer, make it different. More psychologically demanding, less predictably physical." Harrington frowned. "Hell Week's tradition goes back decades. Changing it fundamentally... Tradition is important," Ivy interrupted, "but effectiveness matters more. Tell me honestly, how many candidates learn to game Hell Week? They know roughly when each evolution happens, what to expect, how long they need to endure." Davis nodded reluctantly. "More than we'd like to admit. The ones who've done their research come in with a mental timeline." "Exactly," Ivy continued. "Real operations don't come with timelines. Real combat doesn't happen on a schedule you can prepare for. We should be training for chaos, not endurance through predictable suffering." She clicked to her next slide, revealing a radical redesign. "Here's what I'm proposing. We keep the physical demands but randomize when they occur. We add moral dilemma scenarios where there's no clear right answer. We introduce failures that aren't the candidate's fault to see how they handle things beyond their control." Walker leaned back in his chair, processing. "You're talking about creating genuine psychological uncertainty." "I'm talking about preparing them for reality," Ivy corrected. "How many of you have been in situations where everything went wrong, where your training didn't cover what you were facing, where you had to make decisions that haunted you afterward?" The room fell silent. Every hand slowly rose. "That's what we should be training for," Ivy said softly. "Not just the physical capability to endure, but the mental and emotional capability to make impossible choices and live with the consequences." Bennett stood and walked to the board, studying her proposed scenarios. "This one here, the civilian casualty dilemma. You're going to put candidates in a situation where they might have to choose between mission success and civilian lives. Not might have to choose. Will have to choose," Ivy clarified. "Because that's the reality of modern warfare. And we need to know who can make that call and who can't before they're making it, with real lives at stake." Harrington's scarred face was thoughtful. "This is going to be controversial. Command might push back. Captain Reynolds is already on board," Ivy revealed. I briefed him Saturday afternoon. He's giving us 6 months to redesign and implement. First modified class starts in 8 weeks. Davis's eyes widened. 8 weeks? That's barely enough time to... Which is why we start today, Ivy interrupted. I need each of you to take a section of the current program and identify what's working versus what's just tradition. Be brutal in your assessment. If something isn't making candidates better operators, it needs to go. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. The 4 instructors found themselves working longer hours than they had in years, but with a renewed sense of purpose. Ivy's energy was infectious, her dedication undeniable. She was always the first to arrive and last to leave. Often sleeping in her office when redesigning scenarios ran late into the night. What surprised them most was her willingness to listen. Despite having final authority, Ivy constantly sought their input, incorporating their field experience into her theoretical frameworks. When Davis suggested a modification to her urban warfare scenario based on his deployment in Fallujah, she immediately revised her plans. When Harrington pointed out that one of her psychological tests might inadvertently screen out culturally diverse candidates, she scrapped it entirely and designed a better alternative. You know, Walker said one evening as they reviewed training materials, when you first arrived, I thought you were going to come in with all the answers and expect us to follow blindly. Ivy looked up from her notes. I came in with a framework and a lot of questions. You 4 have the answers from real experience. This only works if we combine both. Bennett, who'd become perhaps her most dedicated supporter, grinned. It's almost annoying how reasonable you are. Makes it hard to maintain my natural skepticism. Oh, you'll have plenty of opportunities to be skeptical, Ivy assured him. Wait until you see what I have planned for the maritime insertion evolution. She wasn't exaggerating. Her redesigned maritime training included scenarios where boats failed, navigation equipment malfunctioned, and candidates had to complete missions with half their planned resources. The physical demands remained intense, but now coupled with genuine unpredictability. The real test came when they had to present the full program to the base command staff. Captain Reynolds had arranged a formal briefing with 3 other senior officers, all of whom had legendary reputations and traditional views on SEAL training. Commander Hastings, a grizzled veteran with 30 years of service, spoke first. I've reviewed your proposals, Ms. Jackson. I'll be frank. This looks like you're trying to turn our training into some kind of philosophical exercise. We train warriors here, not philosophers. Ivy stood at the front of the room, composed despite the obvious hostility. With respect, Commander, we train both. Every warrior in a complex operational environment needs to be able to think critically, make ethical decisions, and adapt to situations their training never covered. Our current program has produced some of the finest operators in the world, another officer interjected. Why fix what isn't broken? Davis stood up, surprising everyone. Permission to speak, sir. Reynolds nodded. It is broken, sir, Davis said bluntly. I've been an instructor here for 5 years. I've watched our graduation rates decline. I've received reports from the field about operators who excel in training but struggle in real operations. The world has changed. Warfare has changed. Our training needs to change too. Harrington stood next. I was skeptical of Instructor Jackson's proposals initially. Very skeptical. But after working with her for 3 weeks, reviewing the data, and honestly assessing our current program's effectiveness, I believe these changes are necessary. Walker and Bennett stood as well. A united front. Commander Hastings looked at the 4 instructors, then back at Ivy. You've certainly won over your team, but I'm still not convinced that adding psychological complexity improves combat effectiveness. Ivy pulled up a specific slide. Sir, may I show you something? At his nod, she displayed a series of after-action reports. These are from 5 different operations in the last 2 years where missions failed not because of physical capability or tactical knowledge, but because operators couldn't adapt when their plans fell apart. She clicked through the reports, each one highlighting decision-making failures under stress. In this one, a team had to abort because they couldn't agree on how to handle unexpected civilian presence. Here, an operator froze when faced with a moral dilemma that wasn't covered in training. And this one, a mission compromised because the team couldn't improvise when their primary plan became impossible. The room was silent as Ivy continued. Physical training and tactical knowledge are necessary foundations. Nobody's disputing that. But they're not sufficient anymore. We're asking 22-year-olds to make split-second decisions with geopolitical consequences. Shouldn't we prepare them for that reality? Commander Hastings studied the reports for a long moment. These are classified operations. How did you get access? Captain Reynolds provided them, sir, Ivy replied, with appropriate clearance modifications. I've spent 3 weeks analyzing every mission failure in the last 5 years, where the cause was attributed to human factors rather than equipment or intelligence failures. She pulled up another chart. The pattern is clear. We're excellent at training physical capability and tactical execution. We're adequate at training technical skills. But we're failing at training adaptive decision-making and ethical reasoning under extreme stress. Another officer, Colonel Morrison, leaned forward. Let's say we accept your premise. How do you propose to measure success? Physical tests have clear metrics. How do you quantify psychological resilience or ethical reasoning? Excellent question, sir, Ivy responded, clearly having anticipated this. She pulled up her evaluation framework. We use a combination of quantitative and qualitative assessments. Response times in dilemma scenarios, decision consistency under varying stress levels, ability to articulate reasoning even when exhausted, and perhaps most importantly, peer evaluations from other candidates about trust and leadership. Bennett interjected. We've also built in control groups, sir. Half of the next 2 classes will go through traditional training, half through the modified program. We'll track their performance not just during training, but in their first year of operational deployment. Colonel Morrison nodded slowly. That's actually smart. Evidence-based approach. Commander Hastings wasn't finished. Miss Jackson, you're young, and despite your impressive credentials, you haven't been through the traditional SEAL pipeline. How can you understand what makes an effective SEAL operator? Ivy met his gaze steadily. You're right, sir. I haven't been through BUD-S, but I've trained with and alongside special operations, forces from 4 different countries. I've studied warrior development across cultures and throughout history. And I've learned that the principles of creating effective warriors are universal. Push people past what they think are their limits. Test them in ways they don't expect, and force them to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves. She paused. The specific methods change based on culture and mission requirements. But the underlying psychology doesn't. What I bring isn't knowledge of SEAL culture specifically. It's knowledge of human performance under extreme stress generally. Your instructors, she gestured to the 4 men, bring the SEAL-specific expertise. Together, we've created something that honors your traditions while adapting them for current realities. Davis spoke up again. Sir, if I may. Instructor Jackson put us through one of her training exercises. It was 90 minutes that taught me more about my own limitations than 5 years of instruction taught me. She's not trying to replace what makes SEAL training effective. She's trying to enhance it. Commander Hastings looked at each of the instructors in turn. All 4 of you support this? Yes, sir, they answered in unison. He turned to Captain Reynolds. This is your command, Captain. What's your assessment? Reynolds stood. Sir, I brought Instructor Jackson here because our metrics were declining and I wanted fresh perspective. What she's shown me is that we've been optimizing for the wrong variables. We've been focused on graduation rates and physical performance benchmarks, while the real world has moved on to requiring different capabilities. He walked to stand beside Ivy. I believe her proposed modifications will produce more effective operators. More importantly, I believe they'll produce operators who can handle the moral and psychological complexity of modern warfare without breaking. That's worth the risk of changing tradition. The senior officers conferred quietly among themselves. Finally, Commander Hastings spoke. You have approval for your pilot program. 2 classes, control group comparison, full evaluation metrics. But understand this, Ms. Jackson, if your modified training produces operators who can't hack it in the field, if graduation rates drop below acceptable levels, or if we see any indication that physical standards are being compromised, we shut this down immediately. Understood, sir, Ivy replied. And if the modified training produces more effective operators? Hastings almost smiled. Then I'll personally apologize for doubting you. But I wouldn't count on that. Part 10. The first modified training class began 6 weeks later. 24 candidates started Hell Week, not knowing they were part of an experimental program. Ivy and her 4 instructors watched from the control room as the traditional physical evolutions began. They look confident, Bennett observed. Most of them have researched what to expect. Good, Ivy replied. That confidence is about to be thoroughly dismantled. The first 48 hours followed traditional patterns, brutal physical challenges designed to exhaust and test resolve. But on the 3rd day, Ivy introduced the first major deviation. During a beach evolution, she had actors posing as civilians wander into the training area. Appearing confused and asking for help, the candidates were exhausted, focused on their assigned tasks, and suddenly faced with unexpected variables. Most ignored the civilians initially, staying focused on their mission. That's when Ivy introduced the next element. One of the actors collapsed, apparently having a medical emergency. From the control room, they watched the candidates struggle with the dilemma. Their mission was to complete the evolution within a strict time limit. Stopping to help meant certain failure. But leaving someone potentially dying was unconscionable. Watch this, Ivy said quietly. This is where we see who they really are. 3 candidates immediately broke from the group to help, despite knowing it would cost them. 2 others hesitated, torn between mission and morality. The rest stayed on task, assuming the instructors would handle the situation. Davis made notes on his tablet. The ones who helped, they're showing initiative and compassion. But they also abandoned their mission. And the ones who didn't help followed orders and completed their objective, Walker added. In a real combat situation, that discipline might be necessary. Exactly, Ivy said. There's no right answer. What I'm evaluating is how they make the decision, whether they can articulate their reasoning afterward, and whether they can live with the consequences. After the evolution, Ivy brought the candidates together. The actor who'd collapsed was there, healthy and smiling. The confusion on the candidates' faces was immediate. That was a test, Ivy explained. Not of your physical capability, but of your decision-making under stress. Some of you helped. Some didn't. Neither choice was wrong, but both had consequences. Tonight, you'll each write a brief explanation of your decision and why you made it. One candidate, a muscular man named Rodriguez, raised his hand. Ma'am, with respect, that seems like bullshit. We're training to be warriors, not social workers. Ivy walked over to stand directly in front of him. Do you know what the hardest part of my job is, Rodriguez? No, ma'am. It's preparing you for situations where there is no good choice, where people will die regardless of what you decide, where you'll have to live with the consequences of impossible decisions for the rest of your life. Her voice was calm but intense. Physical training prepares your body. Tactical training prepares your mind. But who prepares your soul for the weight of command? Who teaches you how to make decisions that will haunt you and still function afterward? The candidates were silent, the usual bravado stripped away by the question. That's what this is about, Ivy continued. Not making you soft, making you strong enough to carry the weight of moral complexity without breaking. Because the enemy can shoot at you, but your own conscience will destroy you if you're not prepared for it. Over the following days, the modified Hell Week continued to subvert expectations. Physical challenges came at random times. Scenarios introduced failures beyond the candidates' control. They faced dilemmas with no clear right answers, and had to explain their reasoning, even when exhausted beyond coherent thought. The traditional Hell Week had a 28% attrition rate. By day 5 of the modified program, 33% had already rung out. Davis was concerned. "We're losing more candidates than the traditional program," he told Ivy during a brief break. "Command is going to see that as failure." Ivy reviewed the data on her tablet, her expression thoughtful. "We're losing different candidates, though. Look at who's ringing out." She pulled up the comparison. In traditional Hell Week, candidates quit primarily due to physical exhaustion or injury. In the modified program, those quitting cited mental exhaustion, inability to handle uncertainty, or loss of confidence in their decision-making. These candidates would have graduated the traditional program, Davis argued. "We're screening out people who might have been effective operators. Or we're screening out people who would have broken in the field when faced with genuine moral complexity," Ivy countered. "Look at the profiles of who's staying in. They're not necessarily the strongest physically, but they're the ones who can adapt, who can make decisions under pressure, who can handle failure and keep moving forward." Harrington joined them, having just finished an evolution. "There's something else happening too. The candidates who are staying are bonding differently than traditional classes. They're more open with each other, more willing to admit vulnerability. It's creating a different kind of unit cohesion." Walker appeared with coffee for everyone, a ritual they developed during the long nights of training. "The control group is performing exactly as expected. Traditional attrition rates, traditional performance metrics. But they're also showing traditional limitations, predictable responses to stress, difficulty adapting when scenarios deviate from expectations." By the end of Hell Week, the modified program had a 35% attrition rate compared to 28% for the control group. But something remarkable had happened with those who remained. They weren't just physically capable, they were mentally resilient in ways that surprised even Ivy. During the final evolution, both groups faced an identical scenario, a simulated hostage rescue with multiple complications. The control group executed competently, following their training and achieving mission success by conventional metrics. The modified group also succeeded, but their approach was notably different. When their primary plan failed due to simulated equipment malfunction, they improvised immediately. When presented with an unexpected moral dilemma involving civilian casualties, they made a decision, executed it, and moved forward without paralysis. When their team leader was killed halfway through, leadership shifted seamlessly without missing a beat. "Did you see that?" Bennett asked, watching the monitors. When their plan fell apart, they didn't hesitate. They just adapted. Ivy was taking detailed notes. "That's exactly what we were training for. Not perfect execution of planned scenarios, but effective response to chaos." The post-Hell Week evaluations revealed even more interesting data. The control group scored higher on traditional physical performance metrics, but the modified group scored significantly higher on adaptive problem-solving, stress management, and team cohesion under uncertainty. Commander Hastings visited to review the preliminary results. He studied the data for a long time before speaking. "Your modified group lost more candidates." "Yes, sir," Ivy acknowledged. "But the ones who remained show significantly different performance characteristics. He looked up at her. You're arguing that it's worth losing a few more candidates to screen out the ones who would fail later, under real-world stress. That's exactly what I'm arguing, sir, Ivy confirmed. We can build physical strength. We can teach tactical skills. But mental resilience and adaptive capability under genuine uncertainty, those are harder to develop. Better to identify who has that potential early and invest in developing them fully. Hastings turned to the 4 instructors. Your assessment? Davis spoke first. Sir, I was skeptical initially. But watching both groups go through identical scenarios with different preparation, the modified group consistently outperforms when things go wrong. And things always go wrong in real operations. I concur, Harrington added. The traditional program produces competent operators who excel at executing plans. The modified program produces operators who excel when plans fail. Walker and Bennett nodded their agreement. Commander Hastings was quiet for a moment. Continue with the pilot program. But I want detailed metrics at every stage. Not just Hell Week. If this advantage holds throughout the entire training pipeline and into operational deployment, we'll consider expanding the modified approach. After he left, the instructors gathered around Ivy. You know what this means? Bennett said, grinning. We just revolutionized SEAL training. We haven't revolutionized anything yet, Ivy cautioned. We've completed one Hell Week with promising results. We still have months of training to complete and then operational deployment to evaluate. But it's a start, Walker said. A significant start. Davis looked at Ivy with respect that had been hard-earned. When you first arrived, I thought you were going to disrupt everything we'd built and replace it with untested theories. And now? Ivy asked. Now I think you understood something we'd forgotten. That tradition is important, but effectiveness matters more. That respect for the past doesn't mean refusing to improve for the future. 6 months later, Ivy stood in the same briefing room where she'd first met the 4 instructors who'd tried to intimidate her. The walls were now covered with data from the completed pilot program. Performance metrics that told a compelling story. The modified training group had graduated 16 of the original 24 candidates. A 67% success rate compared to 72% for the control group. But the real difference showed in operational deployment. After 3 months in the field, the modified group had a 100% mission success rate compared to 83% for the control group. More significantly, they showed markedly better performance in situations involving uncertainty, moral complexity, and plan deviation. Captain Reynolds stood at the front of the room, addressing the assembled command staff. The data speaks for itself. The modified training program produces operators who are not just physically capable, but psychologically resilient and adaptively intelligent. Commander Hastings reviewed the final reports. I owe you an apology, Ms. Jackson. When you first proposed these changes, I thought you were trying to soften our training. I was wrong. You were trying to make it more relevant to modern warfare. Ivy stood to respond. Sir, the credit belongs to these 4 instructors as much as to me. They had the courage to question their own methods and the integrity to prioritize effectiveness over ego. Davis, Harrington, Walker, and Bennett sat together. A united team that had been forged through the same process they now use to train others. Honest self-assessment, vulnerability under pressure, and commitment to something larger than individual pride. The recommendation, Reynolds continued, is to implement the modified training program as the new standard, effective next quarter. All special operations training will incorporate Instructor Jackson's psychological resilience protocols alongside traditional physical training. The approval was unanimous. After the meeting, Ivy found herself alone in the briefing room, taking down the charts and data that had consumed her life for the past months. The door opened, and the 4 instructors entered. "We wanted to say thank you," Davis began. "Not just for the program, but for teaching us something important." "What's that?" Ivy asked. "That being strong enough to admit you need to change is harder than staying comfortable with what you already know," Harrington said. Walker added, "You came here as the new girl we thought we could intimidate. You left as the instructor who changed how we think about everything." Bennett, who'd grown the most during the process, spoke last. "You know what the candidates are calling you? The ones who went through your modified program?" Ivy shook her head. "The honest hour, because you taught them that real strength comes from being honest about your fears, your limitations, and your capacity for growth." Ivy felt unexpected emotion rising. "You four made that possible. I had theories and frameworks. You had the courage to test them and the integrity to admit when they worked." Davis extended his hand. "Partners?" Ivy shook it firmly. "Partners." As they left the building together, walking across the base in the afternoon sun, Ivy reflected on the journey from that first morning when 4 cocky soldiers had thought they'd found an easy target. They'd learned what she'd already known, that real intimidation doesn't come from size or volume or aggressive posturing, that it comes from quiet competence. From being so thoroughly prepared that doubt never enters the equation. From having nothing to prove because your work speaks louder than words ever could. Somewhere on this base, a new class of candidates was beginning their journey. They'd face modified Hell Week, would be pushed past physical limits into psychological uncertainty, would learn that strength wasn't just about what you could endure, but about who you chose to become under pressure. And they'd be trained by instructors who'd learned those same lessons themselves, who understood that admitting weakness was the first step toward genuine strength, and that the most important battles were often fought not against external enemies, but against internal limitations. Ivy Jackson had arrived as an outsider, someone to be dismissed and intimidated. She was leaving as something far more valuable, a catalyst for change who'd proven that the most dangerous person in any room isn't the loudest or the strongest, but the one who's done the work, faced their demons, and emerged with nothing left to prove. The 4 soldiers who'd thought they'd intimidate, the new girl had instead found a teacher. And in teaching them, Ivy had fulfilled the true purpose of any instructor, not to prove superiority, but to create others who would eventually surpass you. As the sun set over Naval Special Operations Base Coronado, a new standard had been set. Not just for training, but for what it meant to be truly strong in a world where the hardest battles were fought in the space between what you thought you could do and what you proved you could become. The cocky soldiers had learned humility. The new girl had earned respect. And somewhere in the intersection of those transformations, something remarkable had been created, a better way forward, built on the understanding that real strength requires vulnerability, that leadership demands honesty, and that the best warriors are forged not just through physical trials, but through the courage to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss